Hey, hello everyone. My name is Mike Liddell. I'm the GM of Digital here at Every Action, and this is our webinar on 2019 trends. I'm joined by the wonderful and lovely Sarah DiGiulio, who's the managing partner here at M&R, as well as Stephanie Loff, who is the senior director at Planned Parenthood Federation of America. She also does digital fundraising and supporter engagement. What your actual title? Senior Director, Digital Fundraising and Supporter Engagement. Let me get that correct.
So many words.
Exactly. It's a mouthful.
It's a lot of words.
Cool. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. A couple of quick reminders to the audience. You are in listen-only mode, so we're going to be the ones doing the talking for the webinar. But we still want your feedback, and we want you to participate. So you can join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag Digital Trends. And then in the webinar interface itself, in GoToMeeting, you can actually send questions in through the chat box, and we'll be monitoring those questions throughout the webinar. And then at the end, we're going to save some time to kind of go through some of those questions, and we'll ask our two guests about what your questions are, and be able to get some feedback that way. Until then, I'll be the one answering the questions. So. I think if everyone's ready, we'll go ahead and get started. So my first question is, every year it seems like people are announcing that this is the end of email, that there's going to be something else, some new technology that's going to take over. But every year I feel like we're back here saying, oh, it's not the end of email yet. So my question is, what sort of trends are you seeing in email? What are you anticipating for 2019? Is this the year email will die or not? And very, I think, related to that is, how are you approaching the question of email volume, which I know is something that we hear from a lot of our clients, where they're wondering, how much should we be sending? When should we back off? How do you kind of maximize that? So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah to maybe take the first crack at that.
So some of the big picture trends that we saw from end of year 2018, so we did an analysis of comparing for about 15 to 20 nonprofits, the end of year fundraising in 2018 compared to end of year fundraising in 2017 to see what happened in December. And what we saw was that email revenue was down 18%, which was a pretty big drop. The average email list size was down 13%, so emails were going out to fewer supporters, which contributed to the revenue potentially being down. The number of emails, unique emails that were getting sent to supporters was flat year over year among the groups in our study. Response rates were flat, and then the average gift was down 3%, which between the average gift and the list size being down, those things contributed to the revenue being down. One of the big factors here that sort of led to some of those numbers is the challenges that we're facing around deliverability, which has become a really big issue in 2018. And this is just sort of a snapshot from one of the reports that we do for one of our clients that looks every week at open rates by domain. And you can see, when we look at this, different domains have different open rates, and from week to week that even varies where our emails getting through. And this has led a lot of groups to actually suppress large chunks of their email files in the hopes of getting the emails through to the remaining supporters, but it all means that we're communicating with fewer people, which is a real challenge. The flip side to that, if you go to the next slide, is we did see one interesting test at end of year, which we did for USA for UNHCR. They were having deliverability challenges in December, and so one of the things that our advertising team ended up doing was testing some ads to their own email supporters in Gmail. So these were Gmail specific ads to Gmail subscribers who were their own supporters, and we saw a very positive our return on investment, return on ad spend for that. If you, I think, click, there's like a little ROAS, which is return on ad spend. So for every $1 we spent on those ads, we raised nearly $5 immediately in short-term revenue, which was great because we were able to get some revenue from those folks that we were not able to reach via email, but was also really concerning because we're essentially paying to get access to people who we know want to support us, based in part by their behavior in response to these ads. They were excited to donate money to UNHCR. They just hadn't gotten the message.
I think relatedly, I remember back at a conference I was at in 2006, Seth Godin saying that email was dead, and this is 2006. It's 2019. It's still not dead.
Yeah.
Still not dead, right? You just have to be a lot more strategic and creative about it. This isn't email is not direct mail on the internet as much as your direct mail friends might say it is. It's not. We have really started paying attention to deliverability. We are one of those groups that has really started being aggressive about suppressing those people from our file who are essentially the dead weight, not doing anything. And our overall email volume is actually through the roof in terms of the number of messages we are sending out, but we've also gotten a lot more strategic and a lot smarter in our segmentation and targeting in the first place. So essentially, we rarely send full file messages anymore unless it's a rapid response moment or it happens to be December 31st. So.
Exactly. Cool. All right. So our next question. So while our world is increasingly becoming more digital, offline fundraising, like direct mail or phones, still plays a huge role in kind of the overall fundraising picture. Have you noticed any sort of shift in your donor base when it comes to online versus offline? Are people moving more online? I'm assuming that's the direction it would go. And also, how do you, what sort of challenges kind of come out of this in keeping your offline folks in sync with your online folks and the development team? Have you tried to do multi-channel integrated campaigns between online and offline, experiments you're planning to do, things like that?
So we have definitely seen a large increase in online fundraising over the past few years, in particular since the results of the 2016 election. I think that the other thing that we have really started to do in part to meet that sort of changing environment is we've been a lot more deliberate about planning integration, if you will, between our online and offline fundraising channels. We actually now come together every other month with our two agencies, our direct mail, direct marketing agency, and then also our digital agency, which does in fact happen to be M&R, and really try to be donor-centric in our approach and think about all the various marketing touches that those donors are getting and try to look at some of those key metrics across the board, regardless of channel in which they are engaging, such as retention, average gift, et cetera, et cetera. And the reality is we actually all sit on the same team, really. Our direct mail and telemarketing programs are run out of our New York office. My team just happens to be in DC. But the thing that we've also noticed is that with online, we are much more timely that you can be in the mail. What is there, like a 2-week lead time or something like that to get a piece of mail out? And so much so that it's interesting now that my colleagues in direct mail are asking me, what is the message? What should I be saying? So then that can then inform the direct mail rather than, I feel like 10 years ago it was like, let's base our email content on what the mail is saying. We've also done some experimentation with things like email chasers as people are getting their renewal notices to, moderate success. We're starting to experiment a bit more with SMS and peer-to-peer texting as follow-up to key donor groups such as lapsed sustainers to try to get them to restart their monthly gift, or event turnout for, we recently had some events in San Francisco and New York with mid-level donors that we leverage peer-to-peer texting just to get people out to those events. And we're also trying to be a lot more thoughtful in terms of our overall acquisition investment across online and offline channels, thinking about what is the right mix of acquisition, keeping in mind, of course, that digitally acquired donors have a better long-term value, even if retention can be a little bit iffy sometimes, right. Especially with the Trump bump, those donors. But it's definitely a work in progress. We haven't mastered the art of it, but I think that we're getting there.
Yeah, and it seems like something that you're also expecting in 2019 to continue even doing more of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Sarah, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, mostly everything that Stephanie said is right on. One of the things that I am sort of excited about is experimenting with new technologies that allow you to micro-target folks that you might be targeting with online ads where you're targeting specific, very micro audiences. And if you go to the next slide, there's advertising now that's being piloted like through connected TV and others, where instead of doing what you would traditionally do with TV advertising, where you'd advertise to a whole media market, or base it on sort of this index-based targeting, we're able to now do household targeting so that you can be targeting actually the same households that you're targeting with your display ads with television advertising, which is really interesting in terms of the idea of creating sort of a constituent-focused surround sound, and slightly frightening, but
Yeah.
all the ads you see everywhere you go soon will be targeted just to you.
Yeah,
It is.
exactly.
So that kind of stuff I think is exciting though, because it's really getting beyond just the digital channels there.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so our next question. As the donor base for nonprofits is getting older, we've seen a lot of efforts around acquiring younger donors, and I think there's kind of a certain amount of fear with a lot of nonprofits that our donors are getting older, and a lot of concern about where that revenue stream is going to come from. So nonprofits have started to become more creative with their acquisition strategies. What methods or channels do the two of you see being used for acquisition of younger audiences? Which channels do you think are going to be the most important in the coming year for that particular audience?
So one example that I have is again with the USA for UNHCR. We did some testing last year around doing a cluster analysis of their existing file. And so basically the idea is a lot of groups will take, here's my typical donor. It's a middle-aged lady from one of the coasts usually. And so we did, and that's sort of what it shows up. And for them, that hypothetically is that big red circle. But what we were looking for were additional clusters that were smaller, that if you were doing a full file analysis and just looking at sort of broadly what do the people on our file look like, you might miss some of these smaller groupings. And we found several really interesting clusters of supporters who were really different from their traditional supporters. And so if you go to the next slide, one of the audiences that we found was a cluster that was 100% African American, highly indexed for evangelical Protestant. They were much, much younger, 25 to 34, a pretty decently high household income, and less likely to be married or a homeowner. So it's like a really different demographic than who we would traditionally target for donor acquisition. So we built a lookalike model around this cluster as well as two others, all of which were a different demographic than their traditional donor base. And if you go to the next slide, all of the three clusters that we did advertising on based on, this was just online advertising, based on these lookalike audiences for these little hidden clusters within their own donor file, were return on ad spend positive, which means we were making money on those ads right away. And the lookalike cluster that was the audience one, this really, this African American evangelical Protestant young cluster, was actually the top performer in terms of average gift and annualized return on ad spend, even better than the cluster that is their core donor file, which was pretty amazing. And so we're continuing to test strategies like these to find these sort of micro audiences that will convert to donor. It's not the only strategy though.
Yeah, exactly.
We have done a fair amount of digital advertising, specifically going after trying to get younger donors, but I would say younger supporters. They don't necessarily have to be donors, but younger and a much more diverse group of supporters than the traditional Planned Parenthood supporter. And we tried to build in with those efforts some surveys after people would join the list to try to get a sense of, was our targeting on the front end, were some of our assumptions going into that targeting, were they correct? Right, and then sort of refining the targeting in the first place, that coupled with different creative approaches in the actual display. But we also really need to, and this is still a work in progress, how we are defining and measuring engagement in the first place. We can't assume that these younger supporters and donors that we are acquiring are going to behave exactly the same way that we have trained ourselves as nonprofit fundraisers to engage with the world across mail and online. They aren't going to be necessarily direct mail responsive. I personally get a piece of mail and throw it out. It's like, why, what is going on here? Or a lot of those donors who then migrated online because it was easier for them to pay with their credit card for all those credit card points. And so we've really tried to develop a much more mobile-first approach to engaging younger audiences, which is, again, still definitely a work in progress.
Yeah. Cool. So my next question, 2018 was incredibly fast-paced in terms of just things going on in the world. There were lots of viral moments. And so it seems like rapid response is becoming more and more important now than it has ever been. How do the two of you think about these sorts of viral moments? Have you had to adapt internally with kind of your internal processes to meet these challenges that come up with these moments? And I don't know, who wants to go first with this one? I feel like there have been a lot of viral moments.
I'm just going to talk about it. The one thing I will say about this, that broadly for a lot of our clients, is that one of the challenges in how fast the media cycle is that there's no tail on anything anymore. And so for our emergency relief clients, it means that like the kind of disaster that would be in the news for days before might be in the news for a couple hours, and then it's over. And so it does mean that we have to act faster and usually end up, for the emergency response groups, actually responding to almost every emergency, and because there aren't the single big ones as frequently, because the media cycle just moves on so quickly.
Whenever someone says internally, like, how do we make this go viral, there's a lot of eye rolling and groaning that happens. So, I mean, generally I would say is that you have to be willing to let go of control a bit, both in terms of the message and, frankly, allow supporters to tell their story in their own voice. For instance, with the biggest birth control campaign ever, which is a thing, what we actually called it internally, which we launched shortly, I think it was in the fall of 2017, shortly after the second failure of the efforts to repeal and replace Obamacare. We needed some more petition signatures on this birth control petition. I believe we were targeting Trump. And so essentially what we did is we went out to our Defenders, which is a mobile first program, and our most engaged supporters, asking them to like send it to their friends, right? Help us get more signatures. So then, the next slide. So then, you know, literally someone says, Planned Parenthood needs more signatures. So can you just do your thing? And so you can see here the number of retweets and likes that happened. And I think the mobile list grew by something crazy, like 170% just with this in particular. But the thing that was really successful about this is that people were asking other people to sign the petition, but with their own stories and in their own voice, rather than it be, you know, organization to person. It was person to person. Right. And then, so the next slide. And so after we did this like birth control petition, one of our supporters received this letter from the White House, actually, thanking them for taking time to express their views on abortion, which is not actually birth control. So we quickly, we saw this and we're like, what the hell? And so we quickly got on Slack, next slide, to sort of coordinate between our teams to figure out like, what is this? How do we leverage this particular letter? Also keep in mind it was December, which is year-end fundraising. So we essentially reached out to this person and we developed a plan to amplify this story. Next slide. Where we pitched an exclusive story to Vox. We had some social content. We rolled out some ads specifically using this letter, and we did a fundraising appeal because it was also literally, I think, with the letter with the donate button at the bottom, because it was year-end fundraising, and it was a pretty good performing message. We raised a pretty good sum of money from that. So I think generally I would have to say is that be quick and nimble and really be willing and able to let people tell stories in their own voice with their own words, and then repeat that story back out to them, especially when they get a letter such as this.
Yeah, and use Slack, right?
Use Slack.
I think the media relations element of this is really great too. Also, like making sure that you're coordinating across the whole organization.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So I think we're ready for our next question. All right, social media. Speaking of, we've already talked about it a lot already. It's you know, it can be a big driver of these viral moments. Facebook in particular has rolled out some new nonprofit tools, particularly around fundraising. But it seems like there's also some backlash related to some of these big social media companies as well. What are you thinking about with social, and what do you see nonprofits doing now? What do you anticipate they're doing in 2019?
So broadly, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective, we aren't seeing the supporters of nonprofits leaving Facebook and Twitter or social media in droves. And so in a lot of ways, if you want to communicate with your supporters, you have to figure out where they are and then be there, as opposed to expecting them to come to you. And often they are, in fact, on Facebook and Twitter. And so we see only increased use of these tools for nonprofits. One of the biggest trends we see, if you go to the next slide, is around Facebook fundraisers, obviously. And this is, this example here from Racy's, they raised over $20 million through somebody's personal fundraiser that went viral.
Yep, exactly.
But even absent that kind of like large scale media moment, a lot of nonprofits are raising tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars or more every month through Facebook fundraisers. We've published some recommendations around it. The biggest downside, there are multiple downsides, but the biggest downside is that you don't get the information on the donors. And it makes it hard to retain those donors because you don't know who they are and you don't have a relationship with them.
Yeah.
But I do think generally is that, and this is hard for all of us as nonprofit fundraisers to not get the data of all this, or even be able to target those people and follow up ads to try to get them to convert to a more quote unquote traditional donor. But I think it's like we have to be there. We have to allow our supporters to support us in this type of way. Social isn't going anywhere, and I even think this year in particular we'll probably have to invest more in something like content marketing to help boost the content that we're sharing on social in the first place, like our own content, because the algorithms are such as that your organic reach is like small.
Yeah.
I think if you think about it, like there's kind of two twin trends with social, one of which is big picture nonprofits, the one-to-many marketing, like nonprofits' ability to communicate with their own supporters is more and more frequently now something that you have to pay for. And that's true, I mean, sort of that email example I showed as well, which is like we're starting to have to pay to communicate with our own email supporters and pay to communicate with our own Facebook supporters. And then separately, there's a trend, I think, of sort of the peer-to-peer communication that has also really taken off. So a way to kind of bypass that is you give more of the power to your actual supporters, and then they're going out and creating their own Facebook fundraisers and communicating on your behalf with supporters, but you have so little control over that, it can be a little worrisome, to say the least. But I think that both trends are true, sort of, and so the flip side of like the lack of direct access to your own supporters is that the tools that allow your supporters to communicate with their friends and family and engage them are getting even more powerful. But those are two trends that are difficult to manage.
Right, exactly. Cool. All right, so my next question. Another trend that we've noticed here at Every Action is, and we've definitely seen this on the political side, or both with the campaigns and nonprofits, the tend to be more political, is the rise of peer-to-peer communications and relational organizing, especially through some new channels like text messaging, peer-to-peer text messaging. How does this play into your campaigns? Do you anticipate nonprofits adopting more of these techniques? And I'll start off with you, Stephanie, since I know Planned Parenthood has done some of this as well.
So following the unfortunate results of the 2016 election, we knew we had to really get out there and give our supporters, to your earlier point, Sarah, tools to organize on their own and on our behalf in their own communities, and sort of take ourselves out of the equation to an extent, especially during the inevitable fight against repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act. So we just found ourselves in a situation where the world was changing daily in the initial 100 days or so of the current administration. Sometimes hourly, and we would have to ask our supporters to do something, sometimes at very short notices, attend a house party, or go turn out in front of congressional offices, those sorts of things. So we launched the Defenders program, which I think is the next slide, which was a mobile-first program where we would communicate with supporters initially over peer-to-peer texting until that quickly became not sustainable to communicate with tens of thousands of people individually over peer-to-peer texting. So instead, we gradually refined our approach, and we would do broadcast SMS messages and use that to refine the list, and then we would follow up with those folks over peer-to-peer texting to get them to go do the thing, etc. We have also really tried to integrate peer-to-peer texting into some of our fundraising programs. We've done some experimentation with this in the past year. Things such as event turnout, as I mentioned earlier, for a recent event we had for mid-level donors, but then also sustainer recapture, those types of things. And I think that there is still a lot more potential for something like peer-to-peer texting, particularly as we're thinking about like donor services or welcoming new sustainers or new mid-level folks, so people can feel like they are developing more of a relationship with.
One of the most exciting things, and folks aren't familiar with it, the peer-to-peer texting tools will let you sort of broadcast messages because you're to people who haven't necessarily opted into mass communications, although in your case you were getting people to opt into mass communications, but using an app that will let you send messages basically one-to-one, but you can upload a list of several hundred people into somebody's phone, and then they can use this app to send a bunch of messages out. And I feel like the big thing right now is that your open rate is basically 100%. When you compare that to email, it's like so different. And so anyways, it's a powerful tool to actually reach people, but
and it also lets you, the recipient can also respond back. It's like they're getting a text message from a real
like
person. So you can have more of a conversation, which is interesting. But it creates a new kind of thing to manage, because usually most people aren't responding to your emails. You're not getting a personal message back.
But it's so great. It's like part of what makes it magical, right? It's like, but I started doing email organizing in the late 90s, and people would write back to the emails all the time. Like they were like,
they still do.
They still do.
Right.
Okay.
You know.
Exactly.
But
like, somebody who does
exactly.
I hear an earful sometimes. Donor services people anyway.
Exactly.
So.
Cool. Well, I think this was part of your presentation, but when we were talking earlier, I have to say I love this graphic because it basically has multi-channel written all over it.
Yeah.
You called, you rallied, you emailed, you shared, you tweeted, you donated. It's great that you have an audience that's willing to do all these different things, and you're getting your multi-channel view of how they can
Omni-channel.
Omni-channel. Omni-channel. Let me get the right buzzwords in. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Awesome. Great. So my next question, what do you see as the latest in digital fundraising trends in 2019? So specifically on fundraising, whether it's channels, messaging, automation, anything you've noticed with your own campaigns, or just broadly in the nonprofit industry. And feel free to throw in any predictions for 2019 if you want to as well. Maybe we'll do this again in a year and see if any of these hold up. But exactly. Sarah, do you want to kick this one off?
Here. So we've already touched on this a bunch, but I think we can't really understate how important it is to really be aware of how people are using their different devices, and that somebody is on their mobile phone and they're on their desktop and they're switching back and forth. And if we're only thinking about interacting with them on one platform, we're really missing the boat. This was some analysis we did for one specific client where we found that 74% of donations were happening on a desktop, but 59% of those donations had interacted with a mobile device at some point, with a generally seen an ad on a mobile device prior to making that conversion on the desktop. And so it really, whereas people who are converting on mobile, which is a much smaller number, they're less likely to have seen your stuff on the desktop. And it really, overall, what it makes us realize is that this is not surprising, really, but people are looking at something on their phone, they're seeing an ad, and they're going to their desktop to type it in and actually finish the conversion. And that's not the only way that conversions are happening, but it's a big thing. And so really making sure you know who your supporters are across those devices is really critical. And that's only gotten bigger in the last year.
We've also really had to, given this sort of phenomena that we've seen, we've also tested things like mobile copy length, and generally what we've found is that shorter copy works better on mobile devices than longer form copy. I think that there's still, frankly, a lot of experimentation to do in terms of really optimizing the mobile experience. The mobile conversion experience, if you will, from someone clicking on that ad off to make a gift or join the list.
And I think overall what this really says is, like, I think a lot of groups have gone through that phase of making everything mobile responsive so it shrinks down, it doesn't look terrible, but it's actually making sure you have the right content on a mobile device. The same content, just optimized, isn't actually going to work as well as content that's specific for mobile. If you go to the next slide, we've done some testing with Apple Pay implementation. So one of our clients, we tested Apple Pay implementation and then tracked the conversion on mobile devices before and after the Apple Pay implementation. We saw an 18% increase in conversion rates on mobile devices when we added Apple Pay to the donation form itself. And then this is where I start to get really excited. It's even cooler if you go to the next slide. We did some testing last year for, again, for USA, for UNHCR, where we added Apple Pay to the ad itself for people who were on an iOS device. So if you were on an iOS device, which is an iPad or an iPhone, the ads that we were showing you had a donate with Apple Pay button in them. So we're skipping the whole thing where you have to click through and go to the landing page and choose how you want to pay. We were embedding it in the ad, and we saw a really big boost in conversion rates from these ads for people who were on iOS devices, which was pretty exciting. And I think this is where it's at. The other big trend I wanted to flag is marketing automation. So these are some examples from the for-profit world. Everybody, I'm sure, who's on this webinar experiences this, right? You get a birthday coupon from somebody because it's your birthday and we're gonna give you 20% off today. Or that item that you left in your shopping cart, they're harassing you. You forgot to buy those shoes, damn it.
Oh my God, all the time.
That totally happens to me every day. And so marketing automation, nonprofits are starting to use it, not at the same level certainly that for-profits are, but I think it holds an enormous amount of potential. And so if you go to the next slide, one example that we, and then just in terms of how nonprofits are using it, we're using automated messaging to deepen relationship with supporters, keep subscribers from going inactive. So some of our clients actually have triggered emails that go out at the point at which somebody is most at risk of deciding to stop paying attention to us. Not necessarily unsubscribing, but literally the point at which they stop opening our emails, and we have series designed to sort of keep them opening. We also use them to recruit donors and sustainers, to do upgrades, to do renewals, to recapture lapsed sustainers, all of these things. We have different clients that have different automated messaging. And one example that I'll share that is one of the more detailed automated messaging series is PETA's automated welcome series, and it's a complex sort of if-then algorithm basically designed to really engage people. So instead of it just being like, there are these 3 messages, 1, 2, 3, each message that you get after the first message is based on what you did with that first message. Did you open it? Did you not open it? Did you click on the link? Did you not click on the link? And if you clicked on the link and took the action, we're gonna actually move you straight to fundraising. But if you didn't even open, we're gonna start you out with something really designed and sort of a series of messages that they refer to as open bait. Emails that are really designed to get you to open more than anything so they can get you to start engaging with them. If you click to the next slide, we have a couple examples of some of these messages. So the one on the left is kittens, right?
Everybody loves kittens.
Everyone loves kittens. And it's got this like 1 question quiz thing sort of built in. And this is really designed just to get people to engage with it at any level. And then we have this other one on the right, which is sort of a little bit more intensive, which is got some different animal stories featured, which is both sort of teaching their donors about, or supporters about the work that they do, but also getting them to express some preferences so that we can target future emails at them based on which kinds of animals they are most interested in. And for an organization like them that works on so many different animal issues, identifying those interests early is really useful. And then this is just a little map of part of that if-then algorithm, but I would not recommend it if you're a smaller organization. This is obviously going to be overkill. If you're a single issue organization, this is going to be overkill. But I do think if you have a lot of folks coming into your file who have different interests, this can be really helpful.
And one of the things that we're really thinking about, because I totally agree with you about marketing automation, is last year in 2018, that was the year of database conversions for Planned Parenthood. We did both a huge donor database conversion, and then we also switched to Every Action last year. And so this year, the way I see it, that was like that year. This year is about now that we actually have a much better integration of the data in the first place between our online and offline systems. We are working to essentially build a data warehouse where we can do all of our complex segmentation and analytics, looking at everything, and then essentially the place where we are trying to get to is be able to do our segmentation analysis, et cetera, out of there, and then push the results to the platform or channel where we actually need to execute on the marketing program. It's super nerdy and technical, and there's a lot of infrastructure that has to go into supporting that work, but I think that it's also one of those things that once we set up, you can kind of have like set it and forget it to a certain extent, which then I would say allows us to focus more on the more inventive, innovative things that, you know, to the younger donor question.
Right. Yeah. Cool. All right. So my next question. New technologies are always popping up, whether it's augmented and virtual reality or artificial intelligence or TikTok, which I think is very big with the kids these days, Twitch. Are there any technologies you're particularly interested in and playing with in 2019? Who wants to take this one first?
The first question, I feel like so many things internally have gone to die by the question, how are you going to get this data into the donor database? To which I can't even sometimes, I mean, this is true with the Facebook fundraiser thing as well, but I think what it really is forcing us to think about is how we're defining supporter and donor in the first place. And we really can't let our desire to have all the data get in the way of meeting supporters where they are. We've experimented a little bit with things like setting up, we're in the process, I think, of setting up Alexa Donate, right? Which we'll see how it goes. A few years ago, there was a thing where someone internally wanted us to have a dash button, right? To give.
Right.
Yep.
Which
Didn't the ACLU do that?
Yes, someone did it for the ACLU, and it's like not scalable at all.
Right.
You know, I think this might be like kind of a cop-out answer, but I think the new innovative things, at least for us this year, are really thinking about a mobile-first approach in the first place, and really building out our SMS and peer-to-peer texting strategies and how we're leveraging those channels to engage with this new generation of supporters and donors.
Sarah, anything you want to add?
Yeah, we have an R&D team internally, and we definitely have mobile's a big priority for that team. But the other things that we are looking at closely, definitely the Alexa type devices, and how could we figure out ways to make this actually be useful for nonprofits, or the parrots, getting them to donate themselves with save the parrots, you never know. And then we also have, we've been spending some resources and time looking at machine learning and how do we start to apply that in a better way for our clients. We're actually, drones I think are super cool. I don't yet know how we are going to apply that in the real world, but I think
premiums.
That's going to be a thing.
Exactly.
It's going to be a real thing at scale. And maybe this is where the younger donors are going to be like, I'll give you X dollars, and then my premium, you're not going to mail it to me, but you're going to drone it to me, and that, or whatever the verb ends up being, and that will be cool. So these are all things we're keeping an eye on.
Cool, great. All right, I think we have time for one more question before we switch to the audience questions. So my last question is, if you had to give one recommendation to nonprofits who want to raise more money in digital fundraising in 2019, what would it be? What's the one thing that you think is the biggest impact thing that people can be doing? Sarah, you want to go first?
I think this is a hard one to answer because it really depends on where your program is at.
Right.
I would say the single most important thing that separates my clients that succeed from the ones that struggle is knowing what your goal is and being willing to commit to that and go after it. So whether it's a sustainer first program, whether it's what we want to do is build our donor base versus we want to just raise more money. Because if you just wanted to raise some cash in the short run, you might say, let's just jump into more Facebook fundraisers. Versus if you said, I want to build a long-term stable base of supporters, where you might then focus on sustainers, which is going to have a longer time horizon.
Right, gotcha. So doing some internal introspection is very important.
I think if you know what, like really knowing what you want to accomplish. It's the internet. There are a million things to do. You can't do them all. If you know what your goal is a lot easier to filter.
I'd also really spend some time looking at where your program currently is, and by that I mean it's like, where is the source of a lot of your revenue online coming from in the first place, right? And does where that revenue is coming from, does that actually match how you are spending your time or your staff's time, right? Because for instance, if you find that you're raising, I'm just making up percentages right now, 70% of your revenue over your website, just by people clicking donate, that's where you should be focused your time in terms of testing and really optimizing that experience in the first place, rather than, if email is such a small portion, I wouldn't spend as much time on it. It's still really important. It's not dead, right? But I think that just making sure that you are spending your time in a place that sort of aligns with where your revenue is coming in the first place, and are there still opportunities for optimization there?
So don't spend 70% of your time on TikTok if that's yeah, gotcha. All
Right.
right, great, cool. So we're gonna go ahead and take some questions from the audience, from you. So you can submit those both via Twitter. The hashtag is Digital Trends, or you can use the webinar interface. So feel free to go in and submit some questions that way. Our first question that we have is, what trends are you seeing in social media fundraising? What are the essential components of a successful campaign? Why and in what cases would you choose social media as your primary channel for a fundraising campaign? And is Facebook still the major platform, or Instagram, Twitter, et cetera, showing some potential as well? So who wants to take? That's a
lot of questions.
But basically social. Is it what makes a successful social campaign?
We're definitely seeing good results with some of at least the advertising that we're doing on Instagram. It is not plug and play, because I know Facebook owns both Facebook and Instagram, and you really do need to develop an optimized ad campaign for Instagram. Just taking your Facebook ads and porting them over doesn't work, but we're seeing some good results. Twitter, I feel like is mostly about it's really almost an earned media strategy, which can be effective for fundraising if that, for instance, gets your message out to millions of people.
Right.
But it's not so much direct response.
Yeah.
I think that generally, I've always sort of viewed social media as a conversation channel, where you are trying to have a conversation and help shape the message in the first place with your supporters, whereas it's not like a direct response channel in the way that you think of a direct response channel of like email or direct mail or those types of things. So I think it's really having a conversation with people and sort of letting them do things for you, like in some ways just getting out of their way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, great. So next question from the audience. Do you have a rule of thumb for acquisition spending relative to list size or fundraising goals? So if I think obviously if your goal is to raise $100,000, you should spend less than that on acquisition, but any other kind of rules of thumb, ratios, anything like that?
I don't have a great ratio off the top of my head, but when I am making the case annually for my acquisition investment online, we've developed a methodology where we essentially show the 3-year payoff of those people. Understanding is that year one, I might break even, but the value of those donors I'm acquiring in year one is going to be Y by year 3, and so therefore it's the compound interest effect on donor acquisition, which I think is still relatively new, and at least internally, I think that we've it's been a little bit challenging for some people to wrap their heads around is that, well, what do you mean you don't know this thing that is very specific to the way in which I'm used to looking at something for like direct mail acquisition or a street canvassing acquired donor, those types of things. So I don't have like a true ratio, but I think that it's really, we've developed a methodology for showing what the long-term value, but I think again, it's that it gets back to what your goals are, right? Is it increasing the number of donors or the revenue?
Mm-hmm. And I would say for email lead gen, so where you're going out and doing advertising, get new people to sign up on your file, most of our clients will target a payoff of 1 to 2 years by the time at which that base of supporters has paid for the cost of acquiring those email addresses. The one thing to note with that is that is different than direct mail, which makes it really difficult to compare, is like we've worked with Oxfam America now for 17 years. And back in 2002, we did like list buys with Care2 on a campaign, and and I don't think those names are sourced still, but we definitely have names that are sources going back at least 10 years. Right. And what you see is, you hit the 2-year payoff mark, but then you have people converting from that list of prospects. In some cases 5 or 7 or 10 years later, where it's like they finally got the financial wherewithal to be able to donate, or they there was an emergency in the world that caused them to finally make that jump. And so when we look at it, it's an interesting, we do look for that 2-year time horizon for that to break even, but you're really making a long-term investment in the program, and it's not just the revenue, because you can still get new donors out of that subscriber pool. And then with online donor acquisition, the math on that is a little bit different in that they tend to make much larger gifts than in the mail. And so there's a higher cost to acquire an online donor, but the immediate amount of revenue you get from them tends to be higher because they make such larger gifts. And retention is lower, but their lifetime value is often higher. Right. And it does depend on the client, though. You actually have to, the organization, you have to look at your own data to understand what kind of results you're going to get.
Yeah. Anything you wanted to add to that, Stephanie, or should we go to the next one?
I think that with online acquisition is the cost is that what we've recently discovered is that it wasn't an apples to apples comparison in terms of what we were saying our cost to acquire online, a donor was online versus what the cost to acquire in the mail was, because essentially we were using as the denominator the entire digital advertising spend instead of a portion of the budget that we can really try to narrow in for acquisition, because so much of our advertising budget online actually goes towards things like retention and retargeting of existing folks. So now that we've changed that calculation, online acquired donors are actually much cheaper for us than mail.
Interesting.
So.
Cool. All right, so next question from the audience. For many, the ROI, return on investment, of online is far less than offline fundraising. I question the investment when looking at returns. Of course, online has grown, but a lot of our older donors just don't give online. They are the high-level donors. Also, won't the coming election affect both online and offline? So a couple of different things there that actually kind of goes to what it seemed like we were talking about before is, is it really more cost effective to do online versus online? Maybe some of it is looking at the different sources of those costs.
Big piece of this is it is organization specific. So if you have an offer that's only going to appeal to older donors, it may not make sense for you to do online. But then the other piece I would say is that this is just the challenge with online in general, which is like, on the one hand, people are like, email is free, the internet is so cheap. But actually, the internet is really expensive to be on, and what happens is it gets cheaper the more you can scale. So if you can communicate with 1 million people or 2 million people, that's gonna cost you a lot less per human being that you're reaching than if you're communicating with 500 or 1,000 people, right? The amount of time you spend writing that email copy. And so one of the challenges, and the same thing is true in our experience for online advertising, which is that at the outset, when we work with a nonprofit client to do online acquisition advertising, often the cost to acquire is very, very high until we can scale it properly and develop and refine their model. And so you have to kind of have a tolerance for not necessarily failure, but to like push into the place where you've figured out the right target audience. And but we have many clients who see a very positive return on their online advertising, competitive with or better than direct mail.
Right, exactly. Cool. All right. So, what are your thoughts on chatbots such as Facebook Messenger? So, chatbots, for people who don't know, whether it's through Messenger or something else, is a supporter can kind of come online and they can ask questions into like a chat interface, and the responses come back, but they're not from a person on the other end. They're from a bot that you've kind of trained to answer certain questions. So. Have either of you played around with chatbots at all?
We actually just launched a chatbot on PlannedParenthood.org for called Rue. If you happen to be on a mobile device, you will get Rue. And we haven't actually started yet doing a chatbot on Facebook Messenger for engagement, but it's on the roadmap. No pun intended, Mike.
That's great.
For this year, where I think we need to. It's clear to us is that that's sort of the next frontier in terms of direct response engagement to figure that out. We've talked about it for quite some time, but I mean there have been a lot of other things that have occurred that were more existential threats to.
We've done some initial advertising on Facebook Messenger, basically. Using because you can pay to message people and then you have a little back and forth, but I would say it's not quite there yet in terms of working or being worth it. But this feels to me like it's all part and parcel of sort of some of the automated messaging and machine learning, and can we make these things actually smart enough and meaningful enough to have good interactions with people? Because you do get lots of questions the chatbots can't answer.
Exactly. This seems kind of part of that same trend that I feel like we've been talking about this whole time, is kind of making things more personal and personalizing things for people, but figuring out what those right personalizations are that are actually going to be effective, whether it's Apple Pay on your phone or the kittens or whatever it is. Like, how do you really personalize that? All right, so let's see here. Last question is our last question from the audience. Is there a minimum list size needed to do an effective cluster analysis? So I'll let you take that.
Absolutely there is. I do not off the top of my head know what size that is. I will say for the thing to bear in mind with that is that we looked at their whole donor audience, so it wasn't we weren't looking at just the email file. We were actually looking at their whole donor file to try and find those trends across donors. Because often with your email file, you might have 50,000 donors, but 500,000 email addresses. But for that kind of cluster analysis, we really can only look at the donors to try and model on who we want to go and try and find.
Great. Cool. Well, thank you everyone out there for listening in. But special thanks to Sarah from M&R, as well as Stephanie from Planned Parenthood. Here are the links to their websites. You should go visit them. You should sign up for their email programs, all that sort of stuff. And I know M&R has their new benchmark study that's going to be coming out in a couple of months. Everyone here at Every Action is always super excited to see the benchmarks when that comes out. So we're really excited about that. But thank you both for doing this, and thank you for watching. And we'll do one of these again soon, I'm sure.
Awesome.
So, thanks.
Thanks.